Benvenuti, welcome to everybody. We are now in the Museum of the Mediterranean, Egypt and the Near East of Sapienza University of Rome. Buonasera, benvenuti nel Museo del Vicino Oriente, Egitto e Mediterraneo dell'Università Sapienza di Roma. E iniziamo oggi i sabati museali del mese di maggio, che come sapete sono dedicati a una serie di eventi. Ci saranno anche laboratori per i ragazzi, ci saranno delle altre performance, esporremo dei reperti unici, straordinari, che sono stati di recente ritrovati, e questa sera iniziamo nel modo migliore con un studioso di grandissimo livello, molto famoso, il dottor Felix Höflmayer, che ringrazio di essere qui, dell'Accademia delle Scienze Austriache, il quale ha una fulgida carriera, ha iniziato ovviamente laureandosi all'Università di Vienna, poi ha avuto un percorso nell'ambito della ricerca SCIEM 2000, importantissimo progetto del professor Manfred Bitak per la ricostruzione della sincronizzazione della cronologia del Vicino Oriente nel secondo millennio avanti Cristo, e a seguito di questa esperienza ha sviluppato un grande interesse verso l'applicazione della datazione del radiocarbonio. Lui è anche un egittologo, oltre che un archeologo del Southern Levant, e da lì, attraverso anche una borsa postdottorato all'Università di Chicago, che ha avuto nel 2013-2015, con importanti contributi, ha contribuito moltissimo, potete vedere i suoi innumerevoli pubblicazioni, alla ricostruzione della cronologia del Levante, sempre con un'attitudine critica e con una grandissima rigore metodologico. Quindi oggi lui ci parlerà di una nuova impresa. When you started in 2015 in Lachis, 17, questo nuovo scavo che ha ripreso in uno dei più importanti siti della Palestina, Tel Aviv. Questo scavo è molto, sapete, è un sito multifase con un'occupazione attraverso tutte le epoche storiche che tracciano la storia del Levante meridionale, quindi sentire dalla viva voce dell'archeologo i primi risultati di queste rinnovate ricerche è un'occasione unica, straordinaria, penso. In più a questo dobbiamo aggiungere anche questa sua linea di ricerca. Noi abbiamo anche un progetto comune, Common Project, that is the let's say assessment through radiocarbon of the stratigraphies of the Middle Bronze Age in the Levant. So we started working together, the two institutions, Sapienza and the Academy, Österreichische Akademie der Wissenschaften. So I'm very happy to have you here. I don't want to take time, I want to recommend the audience to ask something at the end, even concerning also concerning the other issues that Dr. Höflmayer has studied or has published, because he is here. Take this opportunity to ask him everything. He is also a very nice scholar, so I met him many years ago, but I don't want to start with these anecdotics, because these are reserved for the end of the lecture, when he first dated some samples from Madrawi, the other side we are dealing with. So, thank you, Felix, to be here. And
yeah, thank you very much for this very kind invitation and introduction, and thank all of you for coming to this wonderful museum this evening. And of course, I thank also the thousands of people on your live stream on your Facebook page. Hi.
Yes, they are.
I always enjoy it very much when I have the opportunity to come to Rome, and I benefit from this very much because before I started with Egyptology and eventually moved to Near Eastern archaeology, I started actually with classical archaeology and did an MA in Vienna before I moved to more to the east. Anyhow, today I am very happy to present you a little bit of our work, a little bit about the background of our work and why we actually started to excavate in Lachis. It's mainly about the end of the Middle Bronze Age in the Levant, about the Hyksos occupation of Egypt and the end of the Second Intermediate period in Egypt, and how this has to do with chronology on the one hand and with our project at Lachis on the other side. As you can see in the bottom row, we have a lot of institutions that we are working with. Of course, I have to thank my own institution, the Institute of Oriental European Archaeology of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. But very important is the Austrian Science Fund to actually all this money that we can spend on exploring chronology and the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And we are also working together with the University of Vienna, with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and with the American Institute in Jerusalem, the Albright Institute, where our shipping container with all the finds is stored and so on. Anyhow, a little bit of an outline of the coming talk. I will start a little bit about generally the historical reconstruction of the end of the Middle Bronze Age in the Levant and what people thought about the major destructions that we can see at many sites at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. We will shortly summarize the actual textual sources that we have for the end of the Middle Bronze Age and the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt, and then come to the big question about high and low chronologies and why they are so important when it comes to reconstructing a historical model and try to recreate a historical narrative. And this leaves us with some hypotheses which we would like to test with our excavation in Lachis. And then I'm presenting some first results from Lachis and to summarize with some conclusions. But anyhow, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can always ask. So what we see here is basically a map of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Nile Delta with some of the major sites that we will talk about in this talk. And on the left-hand side, we see the chronology of Egypt with the Middle Kingdom, the 13th dynasty, the Hyksos period, and the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty, according to more or less standard chronological reconstruction. And on the right-hand side, the usual chronological timeline for the southern Levant. We have the Middle Bronze Age 1, the Middle Bronze Age 2-3 period, Late Bronze Age 1, Late Bronze Age 2A to B, and so on. And also this is according to the general textbooks you find in the field, or according to the usual reconstructions, handbooks, and lexicons and so on. We will be dealing mostly with this part, with the southern Levant, a little bit with Egypt, and I noted the most important points. Tel El Daba, of course, is a crucial site, one of the biggest sites of the Eastern Mediterranean in the Middle Bronze Age, and is for various chronological reasons very important, and I will address this shortly. That's our site, Lachis over there. Concerning the end of the Middle Bronze Age, several scholars over the years have worked on the historical narrative of the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and I just quoted two of them, Jim Weinstein of Cornell University and William Deaver. And on the right-hand side, I took an image from the publication by Bill Deaver, where he actually showed that at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, that's approximately here, most of the sites of the southern Levant faced a huge destruction, conflagration. Sites were burned and destroyed, and almost all the sites you have a settlement gap, sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little bit longer. But something happened at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And what could that be? So that's just for a very graphical illustration. The end of the Middle Bronze Age, we have these huge destruction horizons all over the southern Levant. And this was interpreted usually as being the result of the Egyptians expelling the Hyksos from northern Egypt. So you might know that in the Second Intermediate period, the Hyksos Canaanite or Levantine origin, ruled in northern Egypt. And the usual historical interpretation goes like this, that at some point the Egyptians waged war against them with Kamose and Ahmose, and eventually were able to capture, to conquer Avaris, which is a modern day Tel Daba, to expel the Hyksos, and then drove them into the Levant and probably destroyed many cities in the wake of this expulsion. Concerning the end of the Middle Bronze Age, we can distinguish in the historical reconstruction between maximalists and minimalists. So maximalists like Bill Diva, or also Catherine Kenyon, or other people as well, they thought all these destructions at the end of the Middle Bronze Age were done by the Egyptian army. So the Egyptians conquered Tel Daba, ancient Avaris, followed the Hyksos into the Levant, destroying all their strongholds. In 1989, Jim Höflmayer wrote an article which was published in Levant, which was a very important article. And he looked at all the Egyptian texts and came to the conclusion, okay, actually from the Egyptological side of view, we don't have any reason to assume that the Egyptians did all this. There's no single text where they actually say, okay, we destroyed, I don't know, Lachis and several other sites. And he came to the conclusion, okay, there's simply no support for a systematic destruction of Canaanite cities which brought the Middle Bronze Age to an end. So that was the minimalistic interpretation of this phenomenon at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Nevertheless, there was a long series of papers then published, and it was everything very polemic. It's very fun to read if you enjoy this kind of thing. Nevertheless, arguments were exchanged, but current scholarship is still, and you can quote Aaron Burke or other people, that basically the Egyptians went to the Levant, destroyed cities. That's the start, the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and then the beginning of the Late Bronze Age. That's like current scholarship. Let's make a brief survey of the textual sources that we actually have from Egypt to understand where this idea of the expulsion of the Hyksos comes from, and whether or not we can find it in the text as well. Actually, the idea of the expulsion of the Hyksos goes back to Manetho. Manetho is a late Egyptian priest. And we don't have any texts from Manetho itself. Everything was lost. But we have some excerpts, for instance, in Flavius Josephus and in other ancient texts as well. And if we read Flavius Josephus, we learn that actually Manetho is the main source for, first of all, for the invasion of the Hyksos, and second, for the expulsion of the Hyksos. These are just a few quotes, and I just quote some random lines. So, unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land, and then the usual narrative goes on, burned the cities and razed to the grounds the temples, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility. That's the invasion of the Hyksos. And many years later, the Egyptians waged war, a revolt of the kings of the Thebaid and the rest of Egypt against the shepherds being the Hyksos, and a prolonged and fierce war broke out, and so on. And he also mentions ancient Avaris by name. In his record, the Egyptians were not able to conquer Avaris, but nevertheless, the shepherds, the Hyksos, agreed, so he concluded a treaty by which the Hyksos should all depart from Egypt, and then they left Egypt and journeyed through the desert and settled in the Levant. That's actually our main source for an expulsion of the Hyksos, which is of course not contemporary, but many years later. So in the chronological picture, it would like this: end of the Hyksos period, people move to the Levant, and the transition to the Late Bronze Age would be roughly at the same time. So expulsion, moving to the Levant. What do actually the Egyptian texts say? We don't have many Egyptian texts that can relate to this period. We have some texts that relate to the wars against the Hyksos, which took place before. One of them is the Kamose stele, the first Kamose stele, where war against the Asiatics in the Nile Delta is mentioned, and he claims that I overthrew, having destroyed his walls and so on, slaughtered his people, all very, generic texts. Also the Kamose Stele 2, I have smashed up your rest house, I have cut down your trees, I destroyed the towns and burned the homes, and so ever, and so ever. More important is the colophon of the Rind mathematical papyrus, because it is very likely that this actually can be related with the conquest of Avaris by Ahmose. It's like a daybook, we just have a few lines. So it starts with Regnant year 11, second month of Shemo, 1 being the southern ruler, Ahmose, entered Heliopolis, so Heliopolis already has fallen. The next entry, first month of Achet, day 23, so we learned that Sile, the fortress of Sile, has fallen. It was heard that Sile had been entered, and then there's another entry, and then it breaks off. So the reasoning is, okay, we actually can trace the advancement of the Egyptian army to the north, and of course the fall of Avaris is not mentioned in this text. And another very important source that we have, which also mentions Avaris and the conquest of Avaris, is the autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana, because we learn that, and I quote, siege was laid to the town of Avaris, and I continued my brave acts as a foot soldier, and so on and so on. And then there are a few details how Avaris was captured. And then he goes on, Avaris was sacked, and this guy, Ahmose, son of Ibana, brought off booty, and 1 man and 3 women, and so on. And then another important thing, then Shabohen was besieged for over 3 years, and then His Majesty sacked it. And then it goes on with, the autobiography continues with other things. But this is one of the main sources for the expulsion of the Hyksos. So if we trace it as before, it would actually look like this. We learn from the Egyptians that they actually conquered and sacked Teledava, ancient Avaris, and we learn that Shabohen, most likely Gaza, or in the vicinity of Gaza, was captured as well. And this takes place here, approximately at the end of the Second Intermediate Period. We learn nothing about this other picture that we have that looked like this. Now the big question is, does this and this event go together? And here we come into the tricky issue of chronologies. I promise you that I won't show any radiocarbon oxford graphs. I will just summarize them for you, but if you're interested, we can have a look at and calibrate dates. I'm very happy to do something like this. What I showed here is basically just the standard reconstruction. And you might be aware that there are many different chronologies floating around, and depending on which chronology you use, your historical narrative looks differently. So the first thing that we would have to check is, does the Egyptian chronology, as we find them in the textbooks, is actually accurate, which would date the start of the 18th dynasty, thus the expulsion of the Hyksos, approximately to 1550 BC. And actually, the Egyptian chronology was tested with a huge new set of radiocarbon dates by a project around Christopher von Ramsey, Mike D. from Oxford University, which was published in Science in 2010. And afterwards, they also published this book, which is a very useful handbook, not only for chronology, but also to get a basic introduction to ancient Egyptian chronology. And what they found out, based on more than 200 new high-precision radiocarbon dates, is that the Egyptian chronology, as reconstructed by Egyptologists, can be replicated in radiocarbon dates. So radiocarbon dates, more or less, in some periods there is an offset of maybe 10 to 20 years, but in general, the Egyptian chronology, as we use it today, seems to be sound. So we can assume that the 1550 date, maybe a little bit earlier, seems to be accurate for the end of the Second Intermediate Period. So we can tick this box. Egyptian chronology seems to be fine. What about the start of the Late Bronze Age? And if we go to the literature, we actually see that even the most renowned specialists of Near Eastern archaeology actually pointed out that, like Kathleen Kenyon, that the end of the Middle Bronze Age and the dating this part to the rise of the 18th dynasty in Egypt is just a convenient date. There's no proof that the start of the Late Bronze Age actually happened at exactly this point in time. It's more or less, it's a mixture of convention and definition, because this looks like a complicated graph, but I will explain it in a minute. The Late Bronze Age, especially in the southern Levant, is either defined by the import of Cypriot material, like a base ring 1 ware, white slip 1 ware, these are just examples, or by the start of the New Kingdom. So it's either defined historically or archaeologically. And even if you define it archaeologically, they take, foreign imports, which is in itself a little bit problematic. What we see down here is one of the main results of the CM 2000 project, which was directed by Manfred Wietak. On the left-hand side, you also have the absolute timeline, then you have the Egyptian kingdoms, the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos, second intermediate period, and the New Kingdom. These are the Teledava strata, and these little gray bars are different kinds of imported pottery material. I mean, it's written very small, but you have Proto white slipware, you have white painted 6, you have red lustrous wheelmate ware, and so on. And it forms a distinct pattern. Of course, the Middle Cypriot stuff comes first, late Cypriot stuff comes later. But this distinct importation pattern can be replicated at other sites as well. And this is what the CM 2000 project has done. And they argued that in the end, based on their dates in Teledava, the Late Bronze Age should start as late as 1500 or up to 1450 BC. So it would be detached from the end of the Hyksos period. While this was, how should I say, much more methodological than previously just arguing, okay, it's a convenient date for the end of the Middle Bronze Age and then placing historical narratives on a convenient date, there's also the very high chronology, which is based on radiocarbon dates. So during the last years, and also already in the CM 2000 project, a lot of radiocarbon dates were published for Teledava, for Santorini, for various sites in the southern Levant. And you see some of our publications. We had in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections in 2017 a special issue about the Middle Bronze Age chronology. The Santorini eruption date plays into this because also on Santorini you have a white slipware present, and this from a conference that we had in Vienna a couple of years ago. But basically, if we summarize our radiocarbon dates, we come up with something like this. The Late Bronze Age might have started as early as 1600 BC. So I'm not going into the problem of Teledava, I will just summarize it for the sake of argument. Based on our conclusion and on our radiocarbon dates, we would have to discard the low chronology because simply, from our point of view, the strata in Teledava are not dated accurately. So we have the standard chronology, where the destructions of the Middle Bronze Age would fit the expulsion of the Hyksos. We have the low chronology, where the Middle Bronze Age destruction would fall to the early 18th dynasty. Then you could argue, okay, it might have been the Tutmosis kings, and we actually have a lot of texts about all these wars of Tutmosis III. Or if we apply the radiocarbon chronology, it might be as early as 1600 BC, and then we have to think what actually might have happened in this thing. So we come to our hypothesis, why we started to look for the Middle-Late Bronze Age transition in Lachis. The hypotheses were, according to our model on radiocarbon dates, the end of the Middle Bronze Age destructions would start at least at 1600 BC and continue onwards. And we have several circumstantial evidence because back at that time we didn't have any suitable radiocarbon sequence that covers the Middle Late Bronze Age transition in the Levant, which is basically Teletava, Santorini, and the start of White Slip Ware, because White Slip Ware is a marker for the Late Bronze Age. If this would be true, and we checked before the Egyptian chronology and saw that this is actually accurate from a radiocarbon point of view, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age destructions would be completely unrelated to the Egyptian activity of the early 18th dynasty or the expulsion of the Hyksos. We have no textual evidence, we have no archaeological evidence that the Egyptians were the culprit of all these destructions, and it would even be chronologically impossible. And we thought, okay, maybe the Middle Bronze Age culture, went down for, we don't know, went into decline, we don't know why, we just know that it happened. And then one could hypothesize that the Egyptians might have just taken advantage of the weakening of the Middle Bronze Age culture and basically, based on this, regain control of northern Egypt. And that's why we are looking for a site where we can actually trace the Middle Late Bronze Age transition specifically, and started the Austrian-Israeli expedition to Lachis, and this is funded by the Austrian Science Fund, and is done together with the University of Vienna and Hebrew University, and this is just a scope of the material that we would like to do within this project. It's a 6-year project, and we started in 2017, so it would go until 2023. My colleague Linda Webster, who is also working in Jericho, she's studying the radiocarbon chronology. Another PhD student is looking into Scarab studies, because these are always used for dating context and so on. Katharina Streit is working on the development of material culture, especially pottery, and I try to do the historical synthesis. Why Lachis? Because Lachis is a major Middle and Late Bronze Age site in the southern Levant, and most of all it's well integrated into this complete exchange network of the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have Aegean imports, Cypriot imports, Egyptian imports. So the development of trade and patterns of trade is very well visible in Lachis, and but most of all the transition, and I will show this in a minute, the transition from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age is really accessible at the site. And it is not true, but it would be a nice narrative. We found out that Ernst Sellin actually in 1906 acquired an excavation license from Constantinople for Tel Duver, but didn't start work there, and instead went to Jericho. So there is a common history apparently that was published in the 30s in the Jahrbuch of the Deutsches Evangelisches Institut. I haven't seen the license, the physical license, but I'm still searching for it. But once I find it, I might use this as, you know, the continuation of Austrian working.
To be renovated for another century.
Okay, just a brief overview of Lachis. It's located here, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. That's an aerial picture of the site. And of course, we're not the first people to excavate there. There was the Wellcome Marston archaeological research expedition under the direction of James Starkey until he was murdered in 1938 when he actually was driving to Jerusalem for the opening of the Rockefeller Museum. Later on, this was published by Oliver Tafnel. In the 60s, there was a short excavation by Aharoni of Hebrew University, and then the main excavation that took place, and we are taking up from his work, was Tel Aviv in the 70s, 80s, and then some restoration in the 90s under Professor David Usishkin. And then a 5-year project that was done by Joseph Garfinkel and Michael Hazel from Hebrew University and Southern Adventist University, and some other Israel Antiquities Authorities excavation work in 2016. Since 2 years we are working at the site, and just a few pictures. This is one of the first pictures that you see from Lachis while driving to it, and it's always important to point out to visitors that this is not, I don't know, an Iron Age tower or something like this, but this is actually a construction which was built by Starkey to create the dump. So Starkey had the light train on the tail, and this thing here is nothing else than the dump of Starkey. And this thing down here, we will see in a minute, is where the Foss temple was. Yeah, it's completely dismantled. Yeah. And he had this chute, so bringing down all this stuff, and on the other side of the tail you have similar Starkey constructions. And as you can see, it was the typical early 20th century kind of excavation. The other main excavation, as said, was by David Usishkin, this guy in front of the Assyrian rampart, and other area supervisors. And we had the honor in our first season to welcome back some of these guys, Usishkin and Yehuda Dagan. They took a picture at the same place. It was very nice. This is the site from our very nice 3D model, which Matt Adams from the Albright Institute helped us to create. And I will just, before I go to what we found in the last 2 years, point out a few of the key features. Starting with the Middle Bronze Age, you see the very straight line on the western side and the northern side, and on the eastern and southern side it's a little bit more rounded. That's the Middle Bronze Age glacis. I mean, most of the ramparts and glacis were built in the Middle Bronze Age. Starkey already made a cut through it. And the other main feature of the Middle Bronze Age is the so-called palace, which is a mud brick palace just north of this huge Iron Age podium. This is a plan, and I will come back to this in a minute. That's again the dump of Starkey and his little platform construction, and you see that a part of the tail is missing here. That's where the Foss temple once was. Foss temple, 3 temples on top of each other, very important for the creation of the late Bronze Age chronological sequence. And in the old pictures you actually see how big it was once, but they took everything, dismantled the walls and cleared everything down to the ground. And then actually started to put the dump down here. So nothing is left. But very beautiful finds, a lot of Egyptian and imported material which you can all visit in the British Museum. And there's an actual catalogue about all the Lachis stuff that went to the British Museum if you're interested. From the late Bronze Age, beneath you might see that the Iron Age podium goes like this, and there's a part of the podium missing that was actually deconstructed by Usishkin to excavate underneath, and they found the so-called Acropolis temple from the end of the late Bronze Age with a lot of Egyptian features, and something that is also depicted in one of your images in this museum. And the Iron Age is probably the most it's the most well-known phase from Lachis. You have the Iron Age podium up here, several houses, and most importantly the 6-chambered gate. Left part is excavated, right-hand part was recently excavated by the Antiquities Authority and then reconstructed partly. That's just an impression of Lachis. And because the Assyrian army Sancherib conquered Lachis in 701, and we have the I can go back. This is actually the siege ramp of the Assyrian army, and they actually found a lot of spearheads and arrowheads and so on. And finally, after the Assyrian destruction comes the Babylonian destruction, and you might have heard about the Lachis Letters, and especially famous is Lachis Letter 4. The Lachis Letters were found in one of the gates of one of the chambers of the gates. Here's Starkey pointing at where the Lachis Letters have been found. In the back, by the way, the expedition camp from the British, which also nothing is left of it, was also completely dismantled. And the famous quote from Letter 4, they are looking for the fire signals and they're looking for Lachis because they can't see Azekah anymore, and the theory is Azekah is a little bit north of Lachis, that Azekah already has fallen, and then a couple of days later Lachis fell as well. So that's the basic outline what has been done in Lachis. So what is about our very specific interest, we are excavating in two areas, in area S on the western edge of the site and in area P just north of the Judean palace form to get the transition from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age. Why area S? Area S is this deep cut on the western edge where David Ossishkin tried to get the full stratigraphic sequence of the site, as you know also the other big cuts in Megiddo and other sites as well, Jericho and good old excavation style. And but you see that he basically barely scratched the surface. He went down to the mid-late Bronze Age, but already in the face you had some Middle Cypriot imports, so we had every reason to assume that the Middle Bronze Age should be below. And we thought it would be possible to access the Middle Bronze Age within the scope of this project and take a lot of radiocarbon dates and so on. You can see this here. This is the northern section, so we are looking now to the north. This is the northern section, that is the deep trench after our first excavation season. You see that the sections, they were open for 30 years, they're very eroded. You still can distinguish features, but basically the reason why we went there is you have a lot of Iron Age and late Bronze Age accumulation, and wherever you go on the site you would have to excavate for, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years until you reach the late Bronze Age. So it was very convenient that David Ossishkin helped us to access this. And this is just the stratigraphy of area S. In Lachis, generally you have the so-called Starkey levels, which are phases applied to the whole area. And then you have area-specific stratigraphy. So after level 7, which applies not only to area S, but to all the other areas as well, come our level S1, S2, S3, and then we continue now down to S4. And then some events that can be linked with the relative dates and the stratigraphy. So this is basically what we have after 2 seasons. We have in black, in red, we have a huge building. I will show you some photographs later on, which unfortunately continues in the northern part of the site. So it's beneath all this late Bronze Age and Iron Age stuff. This is from approximately from the 15th century, but I'm coming to that. And attached to these you have various different phases with taboons and small buildings in various phases added to it, and in a small deep trench we got level S4, so the preceding level, and this is already the early late Bronze Age, so we are very much we're very positive to come to the end of the Middle Bronze Age within a reasonable time. This is one of the corner. This is the corner of the big building. That's 1 meter, so it's approximately 180. The foundations, and you can see these flimsy walls attached to it. Down here you have the earlier level S4. This is an orthophoto of this part, and we had a living surface inside here. We also took radiocarbon samples from there. We have various installations like a small taboon and a corner which was later closed, and then after it was closed the taboon was set into it, and some beaten earth surfaces with pottery on top of it. And of course we have the various stuff of local pottery, but we also have a lot of imported material, especially from the slightly younger layer from S2. We have a lot of Cypriot white slit milk bowls. We have this thing, which is very rare. It's actually a grey lustrous, black lustrous wheel-made vessel, also imported from Cyprus and usually found in tombs. And in Lachis it's only the second fragment found in a settlement layer. And this thing, which looks like a fish, is actually part of a base ring zoomorphic vessel. That's the eye of a bull. So we have a wide variety of imported material. We have a few nice special finds. This looks like part of a column and actually is not from the late Bronze Age, but comes from a pit which was dug into the late Bronze Age layers and resembles very much similar objects which they found in the Acropolis temple, which was made in an Egyptian style. We have locally produced scarabs from the, what's the specific term, red jasper and carnelian. Yeah. Scarab workshop could be imported from Lebanon, it's not entirely sure. And we did a lot of radiocarbon dating, so Lindell did a lot of radiocarbon dating. And this actually, for the interpretation of this building, is very important. So this small wall is of the same date as the big wall, which I showed before, the red one, that's level S3. And above S3 we have level S2, which is devoid of any architecture, but we have this finely layered ashy strata, which is very sandy and ashy black material. A lot of imports. We are not entirely sure what's the nature of these layers, but we have similar layers with a similar date also in Gaza and at another place which I now forgot. I would have to check that. But we have a lot of radiocarbon dates for these layers and have got a very surprising date. So, well, yeah, I promise not to show ox-skull graphs, but I think one or two, yeah, slipped into it. What we see on the right-hand side is basically the dark gray peaks are the individual probability distributions of radiocarbon dates after we apply the stratigraphic knowledge that we have from the site, meaning that this group of dates from stratum S2 should be younger than all the dates from S3. On the bottom line you see the absolute dates, and here in yellow we have the previous dating by Usishkin. So Usishkin dated stratum S2 and S3 originally to the late 14th century, so something like 1350 to 1300. What we can see with the dates, they're consistently earlier, and that's important. So S2 would be first half of the 14th century and S3 second half of the 15th century. And why is this important? This will be, by the way, will be published in the upcoming radiocarbon issue. The implications are significant because here we are exactly at the time when Lachis is the first time mentioned in the Egyptian sources. That's a papyrus in St. Petersburg, Papyrus Eremitage 1116a. It's actually an economic text, and Lachis is just, mentioned. It's about an Egyptian official handing out ratios to emissaries who come from 11 different sites in Palestine, and most of them are located in the Jezreel Valley, but a few of them also in the south, Ashkelon and Lachis. That's the first time that Lachis is mentioned in the Egyptian sources, and we know, based on the handwriting and various other arguments, that this papyrus should be dated to the times of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, and that would be late 15th century BC, as we also know from radiocarbon dates. So we are comparing actually radiocarbon dates with radiocarbon dates, so there's no bias in methodology. So we know that this big building is approximately from the same time as this papyrus, and this is something very special, which also belongs to S3, which is an Proto early Canaanite inscription, and one of the earliest that we have so far from the southern Levant, and it's very well dated because first of all this is on a white slip shirt, so it's an important piece of shirt where they wrote down something. We have the context, it's stratum S3, we have radiocarbon dates for it, it's wonderful. We are now writing this up. We have a provisional reading by our epigrapher Hagen Misgav. It's basically, it says something like Evet, which means slave, and Nefet, which is honey or nectar. And there are earlier instances of Proto-Canaanite inscriptions from Serapit al-Khadim. In the southern Levant, this is one of the earliest. This comes from here approximately. So based on our radiocarbon dates, we now can actually link a specific stratum in Lachis without going into the discussions about pottery dating with an historical document which we have from Egypt, and can actually say, okay, this is the Lachis which was mentioned in that papyrus. And yeah, goes together with this stuff. That's area S. We're still going down and continuing this year, and very much looking forward to it. And the other area that we have is area P, north of the Judean Palace. This is where Sishkin already exposed parts of something, a monumental structure made of mud bricks, which he called palace. And we are continuing in the east. You see an open court or something like this, and we would like to check whether it continues in the east. These are the Middle Bronze Age walls exposed by David Sishkin. The gray stuff is a very late Iron Age material, and the red and yellow stuff are later, late Bronze Age phases above the palace, which look like this, very flimsy walls, and a few floors go together with that. We have some complete vessels, like this chalice, which is very nice, and that's actually the Austrian ambassador who visits us every year, inspecting the late Bronze Age chalice. We have something that could be an offering pit or something similar, also with complete vessels, which is still filled, and you can do residue analysis and all this kind of stuff. And the interesting thing about this pit was that we have one of the Mycenaean straight-sided alabastons. And again, we have radiocarbon dates for this pit, and we have similar things also in other sites, of course. I mean, usually you get the stirrup jars, but in this time in the late Bronze Age you also get this straight-sided, and a lot of beads and other stuff as well. And beneath this late Bronze Age phase, we actually found the continuation of the Middle Bronze Age palace, and having worked in Tel El Daba with nice mud brick architecture, so most people are not impressed by mud brick architecture, but I like this much more than stone architecture. But you actually can see the rows of the bricks, and you have very nice white plaster, and we're now getting conservators into this and to see how we have to deal with preserving the plaster. We're still awaiting some paintings on the plaster, but we are not that far yet, but we are still hoping. And the most important thing is that we actually detected that we have another entrance here, so the palace is continuing in the east, and we are opening new squares this summer. Also very important, on the floor, yeah, first of all, lindel, but also we have a huge beam, timber, in situ, sitting on the floor of the P3 palace, P4 palace, which is the penultimate palace before the destruction. And this is now at Cornell University and being inspected by Britta Lorenzen, who works with us doing dendro chronology, and then we can take samples and make a nice sequence and wiggle match and so on. And we also have Middle Cypriot imports, like this one Cypriot red on red, which is also important for synchronization, because in the Middle Bronze Age you don't have these masses of imports. Unfortunately, when we started, we wanted to, we thought that the end of the Middle Bronze Age would be approximately 1600. Turns out in Lachis it's not the case. It's a lower date.
Thanks, Bill.
So we have here a section with P4 is the main palace. The palace gets destroyed. Afterwards, it gets like squatter reused. That's P3 surfaces. And we have here, starting from the bottom, we have dates from P4 and then P3 and the various locations where Lindell sampled dates. And you can see we still have a little bit of variation because it's just two set of dates and not a complete sequence. But still they sit very much in the 16th century and not before. Some of the earlier could also be late 17th century, But if you look at the end of P3, and remember P3, the last destruction was still dated to the Middle Bronze Age, to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, the highest peak is around 1550, where it used to be. There's a but. We are coming to the conclusions here. So basically what we have until now is a major settlement at Lachis from the 15th century, which fits Papyrus Tarshan, the first mention of Lachis in the Egyptian sources. We have this Proto-Canaanite inscription from the 15th century, and we have two destruction events at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which radiocarbon date to the 16th century. But at other sites, we run into a methodological problem, because Whiteside 1, the classic late Bronze Age marker, in Teledaba, in Santorini, and now also in Gezer, which is not far from Lachis, is radiocarbon to before 1600, which basically leads us to rethinking the labels we apply for individual pottery groups, so to speak. The question is, how do we define the beginning of the late Bronze Age, and how do different archaeologists who in the course of time excavated sites decided whether this is still Middle Bronze Age or is this already late Bronze Age? In our case, we can show that at one side in Gezer, the late Bronze Age is already at 1600, and in Lachis, the Middle Bronze Age, what has been called the Middle Bronze Age, lasts until approximately 1550. So first you can argue, okay, you have a time period until you start the late Bronze Age, but from my point of view, we can actually start getting rid of these labels, because we have radiocarbon dates. Radiocarbon dates can relate to historical dates. We don't actually have to decide, we can decide, but it's less important to decide on the actual label we put on these things than to know when which destruction happened at which place. And so what we are trying to do now is to recreate a historical narrative that is actually based on the site-specific radiocarbon sequences, and not trying to use the same, how should I say, relative chronological scheme which has been around for all these years, with all these assumptions that are connected to these labels, to recreate a historical narrative. And with that, I would also like to thank the Israel Antiquities Authority, the National Parks Authority, various embassies, our staff, and of course all volunteers. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Höflmayer, for this presentation, which gives us really fresh information about the site, and I do like the approach that you have, especially you have presented an historical problem, and how you can try to find an answer from an archaeological excavations. Of course, it's so strong, the preliminary presentation of your setting from, I wouldn't say from the methodological point of view, but from the historical point of view. At the end, one asks, if you are going to dig with a question is good, but if the question is too pressing you, then you think, what is your behavior in respect of the finds? Because of course you are too looking something for into the dig. This is the first comment I would like to ask you to answer. Then I will ask them, you, the invited people, to so please.
Yeah, well, I don't think that. I think that many expeditions have the problem that they want to find the answer they already have to a specific question, and I think we can show that by publishing dates that don't fit our primary hypothesis, that apparently we are not pushing the dates to move into a certain direction. So I have not tied my heart to a high or low chronology. I would be very happy if my hypothesis would work out, but if not, even the better, then you can start thinking new about certain problems.
Yes.
And
actually, this one I appreciate it because it means that archaeology is run with a method. It's every question, not only digging for digging.
And in the end, you get dates and you interpret the dates to a certain extent, but we try at least to make it very transparent and only use assumptions that we can actually prove and publish all our assumptions that go into our models, and everything can be checked. All the raw dates are published, so you can go to our dates or radiocarbon dates and use your own assumptions and remodel them, and then you can come up with a different interpretation. That's all perfectly fine. At the moment, I think, I view the transition from the middle to the late Bronze Age not only as an historical problem, but also as a methodological problem, because when you only have pottery to date things, then you have to assume to a certain extent that the changes of pottery happen at the same time all over the place, which we don't have any reason to assume something like this. Now with radiocarbon dates and especially Bayesian analysis, we can add an additional layer and we can actually see that contexts that from a relative chronological perspective should be earlier, it can be younger than other contexts that should be later. Which also ties into the very problematic methodology how the late Bronze Age chronology actually was constructed. You would think that a relative chronological scheme is based on the development of material culture. Especially in the late Bronze Age, that's not the case. The late Bronze Age was, the division of the late Bronze Age was tied to the development of the Phos temple in Lachis, and then of course with additional modifications, but that was the principal, how should I say, model for the late Bronze Age. Phos temple 1, 2, 3, and they called it the late Bronze Age 1 to A to B. And the Phos temple was connected with the Egyptian history. So late Bronze Age 1 is down to the...
It was modeled on the Egyptian history. It was the main basis.
Yeah. But goes down to Thutmose III, then until the Amarna age and so on. But you can't really assume that pottery changes when Thutmose III conquers Megiddo. There's a reason why something changes there. But still people were using another relative chronological term. And then archaeologists go to site and they have to decide, okay, is this pre-Thutmose III conquering Megiddo or post-Thutmose III conquering Megiddo? And then, of course, you come up with different interpretations from site to site. And then nowadays, if a site is dug, you look to the textbooks, you look to other excavated material, you call it also Middle Bronze Age 1, 2, 3, whatever. And I think this is one of the methodological problems which you can come around by simply using radiocarbon dating, many samples, and create a sequence not on the development of pottery, but on stratigraphical succession. And then you can check and address the pottery and see whether it changes in a different, frequency from side to side.
I have to say, because I invited you, I am really a big fan of you, but I never agree completely with you, and I'm very interested in this work and what you are doing. And thanks for not mentioning Tel Sultan in your overview and not putting it in the map, but actually it was in the map in the Middle Bronze Age and in the Late Bronze Age. So as we have been digging the Late Bronze Age also this year, this is a new to the people listening, we are really interested in what you are saying. For example, I am very happy that you have changed mind and that each side has its own this is a very important point.
Yeah. Which also applies to the early Bronze Age.
I didn't want to take the time of the audience, but when I was invited to Vienna, to lecture in Vienna, I entitled my paper Time Vibrations, because it was the time of gravitational waves and we have learned that since 1 century that actually this absolute time is not existing at all in our life. So why should it exist in archaeology? It's crazy. The time depends on the observer. So who was the observer is the guys living in the site that you are digging, and so each old site has its own timetable. Then of course what you are saying about material culture is very important. I think it's a good hope for young people that means that the material cultural horizons as they have been reconstructed by traditional archaeology are still open and perhaps have to be reconceived, rethinked after having studied new materials with good dates. Because otherwise we have some schemes, we associate things immediately, but perhaps it depends only on the history of excavations and not on real data. So if you have questions, please. Okay, I would ask Elizabeth.
Can you explain the differences in between your radiocarbon dates and Ussishkin dates in Area S?
Well,
from the same stratigraphic layer?
Yeah, it was not Ussishkin radiocarbon dates. He used his dating was the classical approach. Okay, I have to decide, is this pre-Amano or is this Amano context? So it was based on their reading of the pottery.
Okay.
And this is, I think, one example. I mean, this change is not huge. It's about 50 years, maybe a little bit more. From the point of view of pottery and relative chronology, it's not that much. But in this case, it actually has an historical implication. Ussishkin, during the excavation, they were already, I mean, the 70s and 80s, pretty much aware of radiocarbon dating, and they took a lot of samples, but of course at that time mostly charcoal. There are only very few seeds published, and we can use them as a terminus post-frame for our single short-lived seeds, but other than that, yeah, just leave it terminus post-frame.
Some more questions. I would ask you about Bayesian statistics. Do you really think that it's methodologically correct to take old samples and distinguish them and their measurements, starting from what you established in stratigraphy, that is Bayesian?
I think that is.
Or please explain the students.
That is Bayesian thing. I have another presentation. So the principle of Bayesian statistics is every radiocarbon date that you get is a measurement and is depicted as a probability distribution on the timeline, which has some wiggles and shapes and so on. So you don't get back a single year, but a range of years where the sample falls into the range with, I don't know, 95% or 68%, depending on whether you take the 1 sigma or 2 sigma range. If you have a sequence of dates, and for whichever reason you think you can assume that one date was earlier and another date was later, like in a stratigraphic sequence, like tree rings which grow each year, or other things like, I don't know, you have the tomb of Ramses II and you have the tomb of Ramses III, then you can assume that all the short-lived material of Ramses II should be earlier in time than the stuff from Ramses III. Because a single radiocarbon date is a probability distribution, and it can be, the range can be as big as a century, you often come to the point that these probability distributions overlap. So the idea of Bayesian analysis is to use additional information to narrow these ranges. And in archaeology, you would go to a site, you excavate the site, then you present a stratigraphic table with all the pottery, you present a pottery sequence. You can also use this information, putting into the calibration of the radiocarbon dates and make them more precise. So you define, in this case we define our short-lived dates from the stratum S3 phases should be earlier in time than the dates from stratum S2. And in the beginning, both of them, you would see, okay, stratum S2 looks a little bit younger, but it's not entirely sure because there's like 80% overlap. But with this method, and if you make the assumption that the S2 stuff should be younger than the S3 stuff, you get much more precise dates. Of course, every additional information that you put into this model will change the outcome. So again, it's not a definite date. And this is also, I think, the big...
You are interfering with the measurement in any case.
Yes, yes.
So one should publish, in my opinion, both the original measurement and the Bayesian, and explaining how the archaeologists built up this subdivision of
so
days.
usually this is done, not, I mean, you find many bad examples as well, but in the good examples, you would present what is the stratigraphy and why do we think that S2 is younger than S3. Two, a table with all the raw dates of the radiocarbon dates. And three, and this is something which not many people do, is actually the model code. There's a program online that's called Oxcart, which is used for calibrating radiocarbon dates and building models. And in the end, you have a code published, which you can copy-paste into your own version of Oxcart and change the model, run it again, checking if actually these are the dates. And this makes it very easy for students and other people who are interested in checking whether or not this is a feasible model to simply recreate these models.
You can redate the near is just using it already dated.
That's true.
It's a very nice exercise.
So the idea is to use archaeological information to make the scientific date more precise, to put both strands of evidence together. And often, and this is the big, how should I say, communication problem between scientists and archaeologists, is that scientists always think in probabilities. But the, how should I say, the archaeological approach to material is not so much in probability. Either the shirt is there or it's not there, but it's not 50% there. We cannot put a 1 or 2 sigma probability estimate on pottery synchronization argument. And this is, but I mean, all this Bayesian stuff is more or less still in the beginning, especially in the Near East, where we are used to date with, pharaonic kings and dynasties and so on, and of course Egyptology especially, because why should I pay 500 euros for a radiocarbon date if I know this is Tutmosis III? But still, I think that's it's worth the effort, because it adds an, how should I say, I think a more objective layer to many arguments. And in the end, ideally it would be possible to map every single city and each stratum somewhere on the time scale, and then you would see some clusters of destruction, rebuilding, and I don't know what, beginning of exchange and end of exchange. And this would be, I think, much more objective than dealing with blocks of relative chronology. And we had this same thing in the early Bronze Age, when people were always saying, okay, the early Bronze Age 2, 3, all these cities in the southern Levant, you apply radiocarbon dating, and you see that actually they don't continue all at the same time, but falls one after the other, and it's not this big block of early urbanism that, if you look at the older publications. And Batavi was a wonderful example.
Yes. So,
So the best sample we would like to have is something like single pieces of grain in a storage jar in a destruction horizon. That would be perfect because it's grain can be stored for that and that time, and it grows in a single year, and then it gets harvested. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So wherever we have the chance, we are using short-lived samples, single-year specimens. But for instance, when I showed this timber, this has the opportunity. This is not for just getting one date from a piece of charcoal, but the idea is to get a very detailed sequence because you can count the rings, you can take several samples, and you can put into the radiocarbon Bayesian model not only, okay, the inner ring is earlier than the middle, is earlier than the outer, but you can actually say, okay, 3 years between sample A and sample B, and 8 years between sample B and sample C, for instance. And applying this detailed information can get you down to a couple of years for the bark, in case the bark is present. And this you can use as a terminus postcrim for short-lived samples which were found in association with the palace, for instance. So it's not so much, we don't use this piece of timber, we wouldn't use it to date the palace per se, but to have a very precise terminus postcrim for a short-lived sample that comes afterwards. And that sample would be representative for the end of the palace. What can happen from time to time, and this is something that Stuart Manning from Cornell University did when he analyzed the wood from Acemhüg and Kültepe in Turkey, that he found out that all the timbers that were used to create these palaces were cut more or less at the same year. So his assumption was, okay, this has been a major effort, and it's very likely that this does not come from a single repair, because then you would get different dates for the parks, but these trees were actually felled to build this palace. And then, if you make this assumption, you could use this date for getting a date for the foundation of this palace. So the different questions, chronological questions, where wood charcoal actually is a very powerful tool, but we would avoid taking random charcoal samples from a not very good context, because they just give you a terminus postcrim.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much, and I hope you can see you many times again with new
Anytime.
discoveries. Bye bye.
Thank you.